a memorial service for the slain high school teacher Mpho Mamiki Moalosi was held at the Tsoseletso High School in Bloemfontein. Moalosi was run over allegedly by her boyfriend last week, Monday. Let's now take this discussion further and bring in Lisa Vetten, a gender-based violence expert. Lisa, thank you so much for your time. I mean, as you know, calls for no bail for Mpho's killer, GBV and femicide have once again been described as a pandemic by our leaders in government. Firstly, just your reaction to yet another woman being killed by someone who was meant to love and protect her, but instead brutally killed her in front of everybody close to her school, her place of work.
I mean, it's a terrible tragedy, but I would actually like to move beyond saying this is a tragedy and how awful it is. I think what we really need, what these kinds of repetitive incidents are calling us to do is to pay much better attention to the patterns and trends in women's murders in South Africa. We can see, for example, that after declining between 1999 and 2000 and 2020, in 2021, women's murders started to increase again. We need to understand what changed, what has brought about those changes. Why do we see different patterns in South Africa's different provinces of women's murders? Because I think if we understand those questions, we can do a much better job of trying to intervene rather than simply calling for no bail. We need to actually prevent things before we get to a situation where there's a discussion around whether or not somebody who is accused of murdering his female partner should or shouldn't get bail.
And let's talk about those preventative measures, Lisa, because what is concerning here, and I need to correct myself, she was actually killed near the G4S Mangaung prison. And that's where the perpetrator left her body, but then later, of course, led police to the scene. But just talking about preventative measures, I mean, one of the things that we are hearing here is that this was not the first time that this perpetrator, was abusing her. And we hear this so often where, victims of GBV call out for help. And most often than not, even after they call them, out for help and then retract, they are still needing somebody else to intervene because they simply can't.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and I think these sorts of scenarios alert us to two things. First, do women know enough about protection orders? Are protection orders always suitable and helpful for them? And if there are incidents where protection orders are violated, is the individual being arrested and removed from the woman's vicinity so that she is safe? Because we've certainly seen cases that could have been prevented, but the police failed to act on a protection order. So that is, of course, one preventative mechanism. Another, although it might not have applied in this case, but would apply more broadly, are questions of firearms. There are some women who've asked for their partner's firearms to be removed, and they're not. And they ultimately get killed with those firearms, which are sometimes handed back to their partners. I don't think enough women know that they can actually oppose their partners obtaining firearms. So that's another kind of preventative measure that we could be looking at. So if we try to look at where it's possible for families and institutions like the police to intervene, how can they do so better in order to keep women safe?
And I mean, when you look at the numbers, it just simply doesn't add up because it just keeps on growing, even where you hear these statistics, of course, that say we've improved here and we've improved there. But we know, of course, that those statistics are really not a true reflection of what is happening, on the ground. But just in as far as, accountability, in as far as leadership is concerned, I mean, how then do we address the fact that if we take, for instance, where we're sitting now, where we have just seen the end of the 6th administration, we are now coming into the 7th administration, we are going to quite possibly see a new head of the police in the form of the minister coming into the fray. What does this then do, for the fight against GBV and femicide, particularly as you have this change of guard?
Well, I think there are a lot of ideas that are in place that needs to be made concrete. So the Public Protector, for example, at the beginning of the month released a whole lot of recommendations to the police. It's essential that whoever the new minister is prioritizes addressing those so that we can address the problem from that level. I would also say that whoever the new Minister of Police is, they could make so much better use of statistics. For example, from some of the research that was done, it's now old, in 2017, but we can see different patterns in provinces. So, for example, the Northern Cape is a province where you have the greatest number of women murdered by their male partners. Probably 2/3 of the women who die do so at the hands of male partners. But if you go to the Eastern Cape, which is right next door, less than half of women are murdered by their intimate male partners, which suggests they're at greater risk from strangers. So it's key that we start using statistics to understand that there are different patterns happening in different parts of the country. Why are those patterns happening? And what do we do to develop responses that are more appropriate to particular areas and regions? Because it's quite clear that a one-size-fits-all response is not going to be sufficient. And that we're also going to need to look beyond the police. We're going to need to look at the Department of Social Development and its provision of shelters. We're going to need to look at the Department of Health. Can they do a better job of referring women to shelters and to helping facilities if they're picking up that they're being abused? So it's going to be a challenge, I think, to think in new ways, beyond just questions of bail and harsh sentences, if you want to make a real dent in the problems of gendered violence. And it's also going to mean, now that we have a new administration coming in, looking at questions of how we budget effectively to address the problem, rather than standing up saying this is a pandemic, making grand plans, but not providing the money to make those plans a concrete reality.
And perhaps, Lisa, the test will come with the Public Protector's report. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned it. Of course, just to clarify in terms of what she found, I mean, she investigated 38 magistrates' courts across the country. And of course, she said that the Departments of Justice and Social Development and the police are not providing adequate and enough support for victims of gender-based violence. And of course, this investigation, which was troubling, was sparked by a case in the Bellville Magistrates Court where Alticia Kotsia, who in June 2020 was, of course, killed when she tried to apply for a protection order. So, of course, one then pins their hopes that, something will then come out of this report because, the Public Protector was at pains to give a list of recommendations and, of course, with timelines.
Absolutely. And her recommendations are very concrete. She's moved beyond just the rhetoric of saying, oh, this is a terrible thing, it's a pandemic, we need to do something. So I think the test will be, does government implement them? But I think what will be even more important is a budget made available? Because many of her recommendations do require money to be spent on employing people, especially in the courts, around renovating courts in order to make them acceptable and to make them accessible. It also means looking at the Department of Social Development. Will there be budgets made available for shelters? So that will be the test. And I mean, if you're going to put it in blunt terms, can we see government putting their money where their mouths are? That's going to be, I think, the real test of whether or not we're just going to have another report telling us that things are bad and somebody must do something.
Lisa, some pertinent points there. Thank you so much for your time. Lisa Vetten, a gender-based violence expert there for us. Of course, this comes at the back of the memorial service that is being held for the slain high school teacher, Mpho Moalosi.